Hey, and welcome to Matador Mike on the mic. I'm Mike, and today we're going to talk about the 80s. Why talk about the 80s? Because the 80s were that in-between time when boards were changing from the 70s, the long drawn-out single-fin shapes, and it hadn't, gravitated towards those toothpick boards that no one really likes. The old elf slipper noses, the tri-fins that were too narrow, that brought about the whole longboard generation. But we're back to the 80s. 80s, very personal to me, because I was cool in the 80s. I was in my teenage years. I wanted everything that was new, hip, and cool, and it was just a great time. You could say that the 60s were the golden years of surfing. The 70s were really like a transitioning period where it got more aggressive and very innovative. But then the 80s took it to a whole other level of performance and style. And I believe that the 80s are when surfing truly became the culture that showed up in the movies, showed up in the music, a little bit like it had in the 60s. It just came out in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, all sorts of different movies that really just brought it into the mainstream and made everybody, no matter what state, no matter how landlocked you were, you wanted to be part of surfing in the 80s, because it was just cool, to use an 80s word.
Can I interject for a second? I just have one little question.
If you have to, go ahead.
Were you really cool in the 80s? I mean,
since there's no actual way to prove it, I'm gonna go with yes, and I could probably find people that would lie for me.
As an editor, producer, I just want to let everyone know, and you, just going to lay this out there. I'm going to find out if that was true.
Okay, do your best.
So what was, as far as surfing itself goes, you've talked about the lifestyle. In terms of like boards, the way people were riding, what they were riding on, and the way they were riding the waves that they were on. Like what was really the change back then?
I think if you look at old videos or different the magazines, 70s was a lot of speed shapes. The boards were longer, thinner, especially through the mid and later 70s. The beginning 70s, when it was transitioning from the longboard, had all kind of crazy shapes. But when you think of true 70s surfing, you think about like the movie Dogtown, where the guys are at the pier and they're experimenting with these single fins with wings, and they're aggressively dropping in. They're racing the wave. The boards were very down rail, built for speed. The 80s kind of flipped that, where the volume went more towards the back of the board. Rails became kind of boxy. Boards became shorter, but chunky. So there was more volume underneath a guy, but it was in this compact shape. And it became about this like drop in, big muscle turn, big spray. The 80s were a time of just a lot of flash, whether you were wearing neon clothing or something that had too many stupid zippers on it or whatnot. You were out to be seen, noticed, and that had its place in surfing, where it was all about being seen.
Well, I mean, honestly, I know as a young man, when I was a young man, I should say, you go out on your board, you like that attention. People looking at that guy walking across the beach. And again, this isn't like Southern California where there's millions of surfers out, It was just a handful back then.
That's right. You stood out.
You stood out right away. And then it being neon, I mean, forget it, They could not look at you.
No, it was great, and it was just so many different ideas were meshing together. The 80s were probably one of the best times musically because of so many different genres of music and things kind of coming together, and each one had its own fashion, each one had its own style, and that started to show itself in surfing. Also, I think the resurgence of skateboarding in the 80s, where, you know, through the 70s you had Thrasher magazine kind of holding on to this edgy feel. In the 80s, you had this whole new style of skateboarding, which definitely took hold on surfing, and you could see the two mesh together. You could truly see it.
Yeah, I remember the soundtrack for me, and I have a few years on you, but the soundtrack for me was punk. That was it. You know, again, as a boarder and a surfboarder, you put those headphones on with your Sony Walkman. You know, that was heaven.
The Sony Walkman.
They're coming back.
Absolutely, but I think whereas punk rock grabbed hold more of the skateboarding, I think new wave, punk rock would blend into new wave, and that became the graphics on the boards, the album covers, that flash, where it became its own kind of soundtrack.
And I noticed you have a nice little collection. Actually, I know damn right well you have a huge collection.
I do.
But you have a nice little sampling of some of the artwork.
I
brand
did.
Names, things like that. Their reflection back then. Why don't you just show us what you have? What do you have?
Well, anything from like the colors. Like you could take like here's an old skateboard decal. Everything got bright, but it was the contrast of being the punk rock skull with the bright day glow colors. You looked at surfing, which is now defunct, and everything would be outlaid with the bright colors, you know, and even like a pink that was just kind of, at its time, almost meant to be obnoxious, kind of be in your face, whereas I think a lot of surfers wanted to, I don't want to say upset people with the way they dress, but they definitely wanted to get attention, and they definitely wanted to be in your face.
Well, I think there's definitely a tradition of that. Anyway, you go back to the 60s with the Iron Cross, the Surfer's Cross.
Absolutely.
You know, a lot of those insignias back then, you know, it was meant to get a rise out of people.
Absolutely.
And it is, at that time, still very much an outlaw activity. Nice boys and girls don't surf.
That's true, and that was especially true in the 80s. I don't know if it holds true as much now. I think it's more of a mainstream sport, and parents are actually proud to say their kid took surf lessons or came and got a board, and now it's just much more accepted. In the 80s, no, you were still on the fringes. You still didn't belong, and you were still a little shunned, or, you know, with all those different groups coming in the 80s, there was definitely a lot of dislike for one another.
We had a hint of a little air of danger about us back then.
We like to think so. Yeah,
we weren't. I know damn right well I wasn't.
But you did. You like to think so, and you like to be part of a scene. Everybody did, and you know, in the years where you're kind of finding out who you want to be, you know, the 80s were a good time.
I seem to recall it being a pretty interesting time to be around.
Absolutely.
A lot of change in everything. I could never ride those boards, so the folks that were surfing, they were making fun of me still on my longboard. But you know,
well,
I always admired them.
But the boards, you know, with Simon Anderson coming out with the tri-fin, it would change surfing so much, and it would become the status quo where everybody, even today, tends to ride and compete on a tri-fin. The 80s are what brought that in, and you would have the original 2+1, which was the twin fin glassed on, and you'd have the removable center, which was often so you could ride it as a twin or ride it as a tri-fin. And the freestyle fin system came about with where you could just kind of pop it in and out. It made it so there was a different style. It changed the pivot point. The turns became more aggressive, and it was the beginning of the modern way of surfing. The early aerials. Guys like Matt Keckley, who was probably one of the first pictures where I saw a guy just way above a wave, and it was something, because you didn't have all the videos. There wasn't YouTube or anything like that to see it, so all I had was a still picture, and I had no idea how he got that high above a wave. And then you had to go try it the next day.
Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in. Don't forget, like us and subscribe.